I never thought that after serving my country, after facing battlefields and carrying the scars of war, my hardest fight would take place in my own neighborhood, against people who were supposed to be my community. I came home with injuries, both visible and invisible, and one of the things that helped me most was my service dog. He isn't just a pet, he is my lifeline, my partner, my guardian. But the moment the Homeowners Association set their eyes on him, my quiet life turned into a storm I never saw coming. This is the story of how the HOA tried to ban my service dog and how I, a disabled war hero, stood my ground. When I first moved into this neighborhood, I imagined peace. I wanted a safe place where I could rebuild my life after war, where my nights weren't filled with explosions in my head, and where my days weren't a constant struggle with memories I couldn't shake. My service dog, Max, gave me that sense of calm. He could sense when I was about to have a panic attack. He woke me from nightmares, and he steadied me when my body wasn't strong enough to balance itself. To me, Max wasn't just an animal. He was freedom, but in the eyes of some neighbors and the HOA board, he was a nuisance. It started with whispers. I'd hear comments like, "Why does he get to have that big dog? Aren't there rules against certain breeds?" Then came the letters slipped under my door. Polite at first, then sharper, filled with legal jargon, meant to intimidate me. They said dogs over a certain weight weren't allowed. They claimed the HOA had rules about breeds and appearances. They insisted that the community needed to look a certain way, sound a certain way, behave a certain way. But those letters never mentioned what Max truly was, a trained service animal under federal protection. They looked at him as just a dog. They refused to see the truth. He was the reason I could even live there. The day they sent me the official notice, my hands trembled as I held the paper. Remove your animal within 30 days or face fines, penalties, and possible legal action. It felt like a punch to the chest. After everything I had sacrificed, after everything I had endured, I was being told that my very survival tool wasn't welcome in my own home. I sat down on the couch, Max placing his head on my lap, sensing my despair. That's when I decided I couldn't let them win. I had fought harder battles than this. I wasn't going to give up. Not for me, not for Max, and not for every other disabled veteran who might face the same discrimination. I gathered every piece of paperwork I had: Max's certification, his medical necessity letters from my doctors, documentation from the VA, and the training records that showed he wasn't a pet, but a fully trained service animal. When I showed these to the HOA board, they barely looked at them. One woman rolled her eyes. Another man muttered something about rules are rules. They weren't interested in my story. They weren't interested in the law. They only wanted control, and they expected me to bow down to their demands. But the thing they didn't understand is that veterans like me don't just bow down. We know what it means to stand firm. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me. This was about principle. How many others had they bullied into silence? How many families had been forced to give up what they loved, all because of arbitrary rules designed to keep everything looking perfect? My scars weren't visible to them, so they assumed my needs weren't real. But just because they couldn't see the war I carried inside me didn't mean it wasn't raging every single day. And Max was the shield I needed to survive it. The tension grew in the neighborhood. Some of my neighbors whispered support, slipping notes under my door that said things like, "We're with you. Don't let them take him." Others crossed the street when they saw me walking Max, glaring as though we were some kind of threat. The HOA meetings became battlegrounds of words, with board members raising their voices, threatening lawsuits, and calling me unreasonable. They didn't realize they were fueling a fire I had already learned to master, and then came the night that changed everything. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, lungs gasping for air. A nightmare had pulled me back into the desert, into the chaos, into the moments I thought I had left behind. Max was there instantly, nudging me, pulling me back to reality, grounding me. If he hadn't been there, I don't know what I would have done. Sitting in the darkness of my room, shaking and broken, I knew beyond doubt that no piece of paper, no HOA board, and no petty rule could ever separate me from him. They could try, but they would fail. Because this wasn't just a dog. This was my survival. I decided then that I would not only fight back, I would expose them. I reached out to disability rights organizations, contacted legal aid, and told my story to veterans groups. I wanted the world to know what was happening, how an HOA in the middle of America thought they could trample federal law and strip a veteran of his lifeline. The support that came pouring in was overwhelming. Letters, phone calls, messages from people who had faced the same battles. It reminded me that I wasn't alone. And neither was Max. The HOA tried to tighten the screws. They sent more letters, raised the threat of daily fines, and even hinted at foreclosing on my home if I didn't comply. But every threat only made me stronger. I had faced real enemies before. I had seen the face of war. Compared to that, these board members were nothing more than paper tigers hiding behind clipboards and rules. I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The more the HOA pushed, the more determined I became. They didn't realize they had awakened the soldier in me, the part of me that had been trained never to surrender, no matter how overwhelming the opposition seemed. Each notice they sent, each meeting they called, each threat they whispered through their attorneys only reminded me that I had faced enemies who fired bullets, launched mortars, and tried to take my life. Compared to them, this battle was smaller, but in its own way, it was just as important. Because this time I wasn't fighting for a flag, or a mission, or orders from above. This time, I was fighting for my dignity, for my right to exist in peace with the partner who kept me alive. Max felt the tension, too. Every time we stepped out for a walk, his ears would perk up, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. He could sense the hostility in the stares, the whispers behind curtains, the murmurs of that dog, as if he were some kind of monster. But Max never wavered. He walked tall, steady by my side. His presence reminding me that no matter how much they hated him, he belonged with me. And deep down, I think the HOA knew it too. That's why they fought so hard. They weren't just fighting a dog. They were fighting the truth, and they were terrified of losing control. One evening, I attended a meeting where the board had gathered to discuss violations. I walked in with Max at my side, documents in hand. The room went quiet. I could feel the hostility radiating from some of them, the same kind of hostility I had felt overseas when entering hostile territory. But I wasn't going to sit back quietly this time. When they began reading out my violation for owning a large dog, I stood up, my voice steady but firm, and I said, "You're not fighting me. You're fighting the law. You're fighting every disabled veteran who relies on a service animal to survive. And you will lose." They tried to laugh it off, muttering that rules were rules. But I could see the flicker in their eyes, the recognition that they had underestimated me. I wasn't going to roll over. I wasn't going to give in. I had already stared down death in a desert far from home. No HOA boardroom could shake me. The weeks dragged on, and the battle grew uglier. They fined me daily, stacking up charges they thought would break me. They threatened liens on my property, letters from their attorneys coming like clockwork. At night, I sat at my kitchen table, the pile of papers growing taller, but so did my resolve. Max would sit at my feet, his head resting on my boots, reminding me that this wasn't just about money. It was about survival. And then came the hook that pulled the entire neighborhood into the fight. A local news station caught wind of my story. I hadn't planned for it, but word spread after one of the veteran organizations I contacted shared it on their social media page. A reporter called me and asked if I'd be willing to talk. At first, I hesitated. I had spent years avoiding the spotlight, hiding my pain behind closed doors. But then I looked at Max. I thought about every veteran sitting in silence, too afraid or too tired to fight back. And I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. When the story aired, everything changed. The headline was simple but powerful. Disabled War. Hero told to get rid of his service dog. The clip showed Max by my side, calm, loyal, the picture of what a service animal should be. It showed me, explaining how the HOA had ignored federal law, how they treated my medical needs as an inconvenience. Within hours, messages poured in. Support from veterans groups, disability advocates, even strangers who had never heard of me before but were outraged by the injustice. The HOA was furious. They accused me of slandering them, of twisting the story. They sent more letters, even called an emergency meeting to discuss damage control. But the damage was done. They weren't just dealing with me anymore. They were dealing with an entire community that had seen their cruelty exposed under bright lights. And no matter how much they tried to spin it, the truth was undeniable. They were wrong. But just when I thought the tide was turning in my favor, they escalated. They called animal control. One morning, I opened my door to find an officer standing there, asking questions about Max, about his breed, about whether he was dangerous. I felt my blood boil. It wasn't enough that they fined me, threatened me, tried to scare me. Now they were trying to paint Max as a threat, to twist his image into something ugly. I invited the officer in, showed him Max's certifications, his training records, the medical letters. Max sat calmly through it all, his big brown eyes watching, his tail wagging softly. By the time the officer left, he shook my hand and said, "Sir, this is clearly a service dog. I'll file my report accordingly." The HOA's plan had failed again. But it was clear. They weren't going to stop until I was broken. Late at night, I would sit on the porch, Max lying by my feet, and wonder why. Why would people fight so hard to take away something that hurt no one? Why would they go to such lengths to bully a veteran who had already given so much? And the answer was clear. Power. They wanted control, and they couldn't stand that the law gave me the right to resist them. But what they didn't realize was that their obsession with control was the very thing unraveling their power. The more they pushed, the more the world saw who they really were. The neighborhood itself began to split. Some people openly sided with me, waving when I walked Max, even offering to testify on my behalf if it came to court. Others dug in with the board, glaring, gossiping, treating me as though I were the villain. Tension thickened the air. Barbecues and block parties became battlegrounds of whispers. The community was no longer whole. The HOA's obsession had poisoned it, and I had become the center of the storm. But through it all, Max stayed steady. He didn't know about legal fights or HOA boards. He only knew me, my struggles, my pain, my sleepless nights, and as long as he was by my side, I knew I could keep fighting. The storm finally reached its peak when the HOA decided to take me to court. They thought that with their attorneys and their endless supply of money from the association dues, they could drown me in paperwork, break me under the weight of legal fees, and force me to surrender. But they didn't realize who they were up against. I had already fought wars in places they couldn't even find on a map. I had endured nights of gunfire, days of hunger, months of uncertainty. Their courtroom was nothing compared to that. I gathered my evidence, every letter from my doctor, every certification Max had earned, every violation notice they sent. I had witnesses, too. Neighbors who had seen Max save me when panic attacks struck, who had seen how he calmed me when PTSD threatened to overwhelm me. The veteran groups rallied around me, raising funds for legal support, sending advocates to stand in my corner. By the time we walked into the courthouse, it wasn't just me and Max anymore. It was an army. The hearing was tense. The HOA's lawyer painted me as stubborn, unreasonable, unwilling to follow rules. They described Max as a nuisance, a disruption to community harmony. But then it was my turn. I stood up, looked the judge in the eye, and told my story. Not just about the HOA, but about the battlefield. I told him how Max had kept me alive when nightmares left me paralyzed, how he reminded me that I wasn't alone in a world that, too, often forgets its veterans. I told him that taking Max away wasn't just cruel, it was a death sentence. And then, as if he knew the weight of the moment, Max stood up beside me, pressed his head gently against my leg, and looked at the judge, with those calm, steady eyes. You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. The judge didn't take long. He ruled in my favor, citing federal disability law and the protections for service animals. He didn't just tell the HOA to back down. He ordered them to pay my legal fees, to rescind every fine, to issue a formal apology. For the first time, in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But the victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. The same board members who had smirked when they sent me notices, who had whispered about me in hallways, now had to swallow their pride and accept defeat. The neighbors who had doubted me, who had believed the lies, now saw the truth in black and white. And while some still held on to their bitterness, many others came forward to shake my hand, to apologize, even to thank me for standing up. The story didn't end there, though. The news covered the outcome, and suddenly, I was hearing from veterans across the country. Men and women who had fought their own silent battles against HOAs, landlords, employers, all of them struggling just to live with the support they needed. They told me my fight had given them courage. Some even said they had been on the verge of giving up until they saw that someone like them could win. That's when I realized something powerful. This fight had never just been mine. It was part of something larger. It was about dignity, respect, and the right of every disabled person to live without fear of being stripped of what keeps them alive. My battle had become a symbol, a spark in a much bigger fire. Even after the ruling, the HOA tried to save face, holding closed-door meetings, whispering about appealing. But they didn't. They couldn't. The law was clear, and their reputation was already destroyed. In the end, they had no choice but to move on, licking their wounds, knowing that they had been beaten not just by a veteran, but by justice. At home, life finally felt peaceful again. I could walk Max without feeling eyes burning into my back. I could sit on my porch without wondering if a letter was waiting in the mailbox. For the first time in a long time, I could just be. And through it all, Max remained by my side, loyal as ever, his silent presence reminding me of everything we had survived together. Looking back, I sometimes wonder why they pushed so hard, why they chose me of all people to make an example of. But then I realize it wasn't about me. It was about power, about control. They thought they could break me because they had broken others before. They thought I was just another name. On a piece of paper, another homeowner too tired or too scared to fight back. But they were wrong. What they didn't know was that I had already been broken once, on a battlefield thousands of miles away. And when you've been broken like that and put yourself back together, there's nothing left that can scare you. Not bullets, not bombs, and certainly not an HOA with a stack of letters. In the end, the battle with the HOA became one of the defining chapters of my life. It reminded me that even after war, there are still fights worth fighting. It reminded me that strength isn't just about carrying a weapon. It's about standing your ground, even when the enemy is your own community. And most of all, it reminded me of the bond I share with Max. He's not just a dog, he's not just a service animal. He's my brother, my partner, my lifeline. So if you take anything away from this story, let it be this. Never let anyone tell you that you don't deserve the tools you need to survive. Never let anyone bully you into giving up what keeps you alive. And never, ever underestimate the power of standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who doesn't yet have the strength to fight. The HOA tried to take away my service dog, but in the end, they gave me something instead. a voice, a platform, and a reminder that even one man and his dog can take on a system and win. And as long as I live, as long as Max walks beside me, I will carry that victory with me, not just as a personal triumph, but as a promise. A promise that no veteran, no disabled person, no human being will ever have to stand alone. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought overseas. Sometimes they're fought right here in our neighborhoods, in our homes. And sometimes the smallest victories, the right to walk with your service dog, are the ones that truly matter most.